So have you ever been preaching and right in the middle of your sermon, you realize that you have lost your audience? They're still there, they're still looking at you, but you can just tell they're not really paying attention. I've basically lost the room. In this video, I want to give you 3 simple ways to re-engage your audience. 3 simple things that you can do during any sermon to reach out and kind of grab them and bring them back into paying attention to you. They're going to come in and out of paying attention to you, and that's totally normal. It happens to all of us, but you need to be prepared on the front end to know exactly what you can do to re-engage them with your message. My name is Lane. This is Preaching Donkey. So awesome to have you joining me today. I want to put something in your hands that is a great complement to this video. If you go to preachingdonkey.com/21days, you can pick up my free 21-day guide to creating killer sermons. It'll walk you through a very simple process over the course of about 3 weeks, just to kind of look at sermon prep differently, whether you're a novice and you just started preaching or you've been preaching for a long time. This guide will just be another tool in your tool belt to help you along the way. Again, go to preachingdonkey.com/21days to pick up yours there. So it's totally normal in any preaching situation to lose your audience. It's totally normal for people to come in and out of paying attention to you. Like I said, nothing wrong with that. So the very first thing that we both need to do, you and I, is when we preach, we need to expect it and we need to be okay with that reality. Now we're going to do something about it. We're going to try to work with it and try to bring people's attention back to the message because we believe that what we're saying is important and has the potential to change lives. So we want people to be paying attention, but we just understand that they're not always going to pay attention from start to finish, to every single word we say. So if we have intentional ways to bring people back in, it can really help us. There are 2 situations to look for when you need to re-engage. And I call these planned and unplanned. Let's talk about planned really quick. So in a given sermon, when you write your sermon, it's good to think about when in this sermon might it possibly lag. And might I benefit and might my audience benefit from me bringing them back into the conversation? So when I'm thinking about this from a planned perspective, I'm really anticipating when is my audience going to most likely need for me to bring them back into paying attention. When I write my sermon, and I would encourage you to do this, when you write your sermon, really think about ahead of time, when are those places in your sermon going to be that people are really going to need to be brought back into what you're saying. Now, the other way is unplanned, or I like to talk about this as responsive. Okay? So sometimes you just don't know and you just can't plan for when people are going to disengage. Sometimes when I think people might be disengaging with my message as I'm writing it, I think, oh, this might be a time where people are going to disengage from my message. In the moment, there's no disengagement at all. They're right there with me. But then some other time where I thought, man, they're really going to be tracking with me here, they're disengaged and I can tell. And so in those moments, I really need to be able to be responsive even if I haven't planned for it. So either way, it's good to plan because at least then you can use these 3 tactics wherever you want. And what are those 3 tactics? I'm going to give you all 3 of them and then we'll walk through each one. So the 3 tactics that you can use, whether you plan for these to happen or these are unplanned and you're being responsive, it doesn't matter. Here are the 3 things that you can do. Number 1, ask a question. Number 2, tell a story. And number 3, use humor. So let's go through each one of them. The first thing is to ask a question or to ask questions. I did a video a few months ago that I titled, Do This One Thing to Increase Engagement in Your Sermons. And I talked all about the power of asking questions. And so you can check out that video. I'll link to it in the description. But just to give you an idea of what the concept is here, is when you're preaching, there's a tendency, because we as preachers tend to be very didactic. In other words, we love to teach, we love to tell, we love to prescribe, we love to say, this is what the word says, and this is how you live it out. And that's fine. That's the way a lot of us are wired. But one way to tweak that is to teach in a way that's actually interrogative, where you're asking questions. Wouldn't that be a better way to increase engagement? Don't you think that your people would latch on to what you're saying better if you ask them questions? You see what I did there? Instead of just telling you the better thing to do is ask questions, I just simply asked you, don't you think that would be better? And very subtly, that gives you as the viewer of this video, an opportunity to think about it for yourself and wrestle with it. That actually helps to build tension, which is one of the best ways to get people to be engaged in your message, is to build a little tension. So some of the places that I like to do this is if I read a passage, I read a scripture, I read a verse, before I just start teaching what it means and how it works and how to live it out, and I try to start illustrating it, I might ask certain questions about the text. Like, why did Paul say this? Or why did Jesus do that? Or doesn't this seem interesting? Or would you have said this? Or whatever. I'm really just trying to get people to look at the text with interest and tension instead of just, okay, he's going to read the text and tell me what it means and da-da-da-da. No, I want to reach out and say, you be a part of this, right? And this allows your listeners to be a part of the search and be a part of the journey in the text. So the first thing you're going to do is ask a question. And again, this can either be planned or unplanned, meaning that you can anticipate where these questions need to go and just start doing it, or you can have them in your back pocket. And when you start to see that people are unengaged, you can use them as somewhat of a responsive technique to bring them back into paying attention to you. Now, I will say, in a sermon, you almost just can't ask too many questions. It's just not possible. There's no limit to how many questions you can ask, because if you learn how to do this, you can basically phrase almost everything in a question before you answer it, right? So you can begin to, if you do this well, you can begin to walk through your sermon inviting your listeners to think about it and struggle with it and wrestle with it with you. Now think about this. When you studied for your sermon, you got several hours to wrestle with the text, to think about what it means, to wrestle with how you're being obedient to it or not, to hear from God about what He wants you to say about it. You had all that time. Your listeners most likely have not spent hours and hours that week pondering your message, unless, of course, you have a situation and a culture in a church where you sent them your notes or whatever. Sometimes people do that. But even so, they're not up there preaching it. They didn't have that time that you have. So by simply asking questions through the message, you give them an opportunity to really walk through the tension of that text with you and wrestle with it and ask questions about it and think about it before they're just spoon-fed the answers of what to think about it. So that's just something to consider. You almost cannot ask too many questions. I'm sure it's possible, but it takes a lot of questions to be too many. Just keep that in mind. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to tell a story. Now, there's literally nothing more engaging in terms of just intrigue, getting people to lift their head up and go, oh, what's going on? Like, here's an example. When I was a student pastor, I was a student pastor for about 7 years, and we did our services on Sunday. So every single Sunday I was preaching, but it just happened to be to a group of middle school and high school students, about 150 of them. And so it's a Sunday morning. We had a bit of an inverted student ministry model. It had to do with the area that we were in and just what worked in that context. And so I was giving a message every Sunday morning to a group of 150 middle school and high school kids. I had to be engaging. That's actually part of where I learned a lot of what it takes to really connect with people, because students have no desire to make you feel like they're paying attention if they're not. Adults will at least look at you as they're fading, right? Students won't. They're going to be texting, they're going to be talking. And so you have to bring them in. And here's what I found, is that when I was losing my listeners, when I was losing my students, if they're looking at their phones or whatever, as soon as I launch into a story, here's what happens. Okay, I say this one time when I was in 7th grade, and all of a sudden, what? Is he telling a story? I want to know the story. What happened? Who did it? What happened to them? Like, they want to know the story, and that's just how we are wired as people. And so use that to your advantage. Think ahead of time when you're thinking through your illustrations, how you're going to illustrate your points and how you're going to give ways to apply your points. Think about the power of story. They don't have to be long and drawn out. They don't have to be these big, elaborate, just most monumental thing you've ever heard. Any story about a real experience that you or someone else has had is enough to bring people back into paying attention to you. And if you keep them brief along the way so that you're making your points and you launch into a story, people that may not have even heard your point or the text because they weren't really there, you can tell the story and then pivot back to the point and back to the text while you have their attention, and it can be very effective. So again, the first thing is we're going to ask questions, super effective. Second thing is we're going to tell stories. Those stories are going to relate to our points. They're going to relate to our bottom lines. They're going to relate to our text. It's not just story time for the sake of hearing yourself tell a story. It needs to have a point, and it needs to support and bolster your points. But there's almost no end to how many ways you can make a story connect to a point. You can take one story of one thing that happens and draw different angles from it and make really any point that you want. It's just a matter of the skill involved of like knowing what principle am I going to draw out of this story in order to illustrate this point. And so I wouldn't encourage you with questions. I would say ask as many questions as you can. With stories, don't necessarily take that same advice. Don't tell as many stories as you can. It's not a matter of quantity. But if you have 1 or 2 or 3 sprinkled throughout your message, brief stories, it can really be effective to bring people back in. Just make sure they relate back to your points in a reasonable way that people can connect the dots. Number 3 is humor. Now, here's the thing. If your message is losing people, if you realize that you're talking but people aren't watching, they're not paying attention, lighten the mood, relieve some of that tension. This is especially important if your topic or your series is kind of heavy. You can, in appropriate ways, lighten that heaviness a little bit with humor to give people a little bit of hand-holding through the process so that when you really come in with the deep kind of bomb-dropping truths, they're ready to hear it and they're prepared for it because they can breathe a little bit. And so different ways to use humor is you can combine these things where you're using humor in your stories. So if you tell a funny story or a story that has some funny elements to it, that can be really, really helpful. But there's just ways that you can kind of lighten the mood and relieve the tension that can draw people in. So if we go back through this, if we ask questions, that actually helps to build tension, right? That's really good because we need some tension. We need people to care. Tension is what makes people care. It makes people interested. They have to know how it resolves. We're going to tell stories because that creates intrigue. People go, oh, what's going on? And then we're going to give humor because it starts to make our message not feel so monotone. Just here's the points, here's the way to apply it, here's the text, here's the point. But it allows people, when people laugh and it's genuine, they think something is funny, so they laugh. It releases endorphins. It makes them feel good. It makes them like you as the communicator, and it makes them more inclined to pay attention to what you say because they trust you and they like you more simply because you lighten things up and you made them laugh. So those are the 3 things that I would suggest that you can do, and I would plan for them, okay? Anticipate the needs, and then if you need to move them around in the moment to be responsive when you start to lose people, that's a really great way to do it as well. Definitely check out my free guide at preachingdonkey.com/21days. Subscribe to this channel if you want more videos like this on preaching. Leave a comment. Let me know what are some ways that you bring your audience back when you know that you've lost them. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, and until next time, I will see you in the next video.